She didn't stop to think. She just helped. She had no idea what she had just started. The man on the floor of the parking garage was choking on his own blood. 3 ribs caved in from a steel pipe, his bodyguards either dead or scattered, and the woman kneeling over him in scrubs that still smelled like hospital antiseptic had no idea that the city she lived in answered to him. She only knew that a man was dying, and her hands remembered what 4 years of trauma nursing had taught them. She tore his shirt open. She found the punctured lung by feel before she found it by sight. She used her own car keys to relieve the pressure building in his chest because there was nothing else in reach, and she did it without flinching, without crying, without asking who he was or why 3 men had tried to kill him in a place that smelled like motor oil and concrete dust. When his eyes opened, hazy and unfocused, the first thing he saw was her face. Round, soft, furious with concentration, sweat at her temple, dark hair falling loose from its clip. The last thing he saw before the ambulance lights swallowed her was her back disappearing through the stairwell door, because sirens made her nervous and questions made her more nervous than that. And she had learned a long time ago that good deeds were easier to walk away from than to explain. She never gave her name. She never asked his. He found out anyway. Men like Dante Voss always did. 6 months earlier, Marisol Reyes had been folding hospital gowns in a supply closet, doing the math on her rent for the 4th time that week, and getting the same number no matter how she arranged it. She was 28 years old and built like a woman who had spent her whole life being told to apologize for the space she took up. Wide hips, soft arms, a laugh that came from somewhere low and real, when she let herself laugh at all anymore. She kept her hair pulled back and her uniform pressed and her opinions to herself, because opinions had a cost when you were the only nurse on the floor who got asked, more than once, if she was sure she could keep up with the physical demands of the job. She could. She always had. Nobody on that floor moved faster in a code blue than Marisol Reyes, and nobody held a dying patient's hand longer after the code was called, after the room emptied, after the family left to grieve somewhere else. She was good at the part of the job that broke other people. She had decided a long time ago that her body being big didn't make her hands any less capable, and she had stopped waiting for anyone else to agree with her. She still heard it, though. The pause before people looked at her chart. The surprise in a patient's voice when she lifted them like it was nothing. Her mother had raised her on the same sentence, over and over, until it had worn a groove into her like a riverbed. You are not what they say you are. You are what you do. Her mother was gone 3 years now, and Marisol still talked to her sometimes, in the quiet of her apartment, in the dark, when the rent math didn't work and the loneliness pressed in like a held breath. She had built a small, careful life. A studio apartment, 2 bus transfers from the hospital. A co-worker, Priya, who she ate lunch with most days and trusted with most things, though not everything. A 19-year-old brother, Mateo, 2 years into a degree he was paying for with a job at a tire shop, because Marisol had told him their mother's death didn't get to also take his future, not if she had anything to do with it. She worked double shifts to make that true. She told herself it was enough. It wasn't, not by the numbers. But she was the kind of person who would rather be tired and proud than comfortable and small, and so she kept going, kept showing up, kept being the nurse who got there first and left last, the woman who noticed things other people walked past. That was the only reason she was in that parking garage at 2 in the morning. She had stayed late to cover for a sick coworker, cut through the garage because the bus stop on that side ran later, and walked straight into the aftermath of an ambush meant to end the life of a man whose name she didn't know and whose world she could not have imagined. She didn't know, kneeling over him with her hands slick with his blood, that the men lying dead around them belonged to a rival family. She didn't know that the man gasping under her hands controlled freight routes and warehouses and a piece of the city's underside that most people spent their whole lives never seeing. She didn't know any of it. She only knew his pulse was thready and his lung was collapsing, and somebody had to do something. So she did. Dante Voss did not forget faces. It was a survival skill before it was anything else, sharpened over 15 years of building an empire out of the wreckage his father had left behind. An empire he ran with a precision that unsettled even the men who worked for him. He remembered faces, voices, the particular way a person's hands moved when they were lying and when they weren't. He remembered hers with a clarity that disturbed him more than the 3 broken ribs had. He woke up in a private room 2 floors above the one she worked on. In a hospital his organization quietly owned a controlling stake in, surrounded by men who answered to him and doctors who knew better than to ask questions. And the only thing he wanted to know was the name of the woman who had saved his life and walked away without waiting to be thanked. It took his head of security 4 days to find her. Marisol Reyes, 28, trauma nurse. No criminal record. No family connections to anyone who mattered in his world. A brother in community college. A dead mother. A landlord 3 months from raising her rent past what she could afford. Nobody, by the standards of the world Dante moved through. Everybody, by the only standard that had ever actually mattered to him, which was, who runs toward the wreck instead of away from it. He had men who ran toward gunfire because he paid them to. He had never, not once in 15 years, met someone who ran toward a dying stranger because it simply didn't occur to her to do anything else. He sent for her, not with threats. He wasn't a fool, and a woman who'd spent a career around trauma wasn't going to be cowed by men in suits, but with a request, polite and oddly formal, delivered by a driver who held the car door and called her ma'am and told her Mr. Voss would like the chance to thank her properly, if she'd allow it. She almost said no. She had bills to pay and a shift in 6 hours and a healthy distrust of black cars idling outside her apartment building. But there was something in the careful, almost nervous way the driver delivered the message, like he'd rehearsed it, that made her curious despite herself. She told herself she'd go once. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She had no idea she was about to walk into the middle of someone else's war. The house wasn't what she expected. She had pictured marble and gold, something gaudy and loud, the way she imagined men with that kind of money to live. Instead, she found dark wood and low light, a study full of books that looked red rather than decorative, and a man standing at the window with his ribs still bandaged under a black sweater, who turned around when she walked in and looked at her like he was trying to solve something. "You left before I could thank you," he said. "You were busy bleeding," she said. "I figured the thank you could wait." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a smile, but close to the idea of one. "Most people who find out who I am don't talk to me like that. I don't know who you are," Marisol said, and meant it. "I know you had a collapsed lung and 3 guys who needed an ambulance more than an obituary. That's all I know." He studied her for a long moment. Long enough that she felt the urge to fill the silence and made herself not do it. She had learned, in 9 years of nursing, that silence usually told her more about a person than words did. "Dante Voss," he said finally, like he was testing whether the name would change anything on her face. It didn't. She'd never heard it before in her life, and it showed. "Marisol Reyes," she said, and held out her hand like this was a normal introduction between normal people, which made the corner of his mouth do something it apparently didn't do very often. He shook her hand. His grip was careful, like he was used to being stronger than the people around him and had trained himself not to forget it. "I'd like to repay you," he said. "Whatever you need. Name it." "I don't need anything," she said, which was a lie, and they both seemed to know it. But she said it anyway because needing things from a stranger in an expensive house felt like a door she didn't want to open. "Everyone needs something, Ms. Reyes." "Then I'll let you know," she said. "If I ever do." She left that night without taking anything from him, and she told herself, on the bus ride home, that this was the end of it. A strange story she'd tell Priya over lunch and never think about again. She was wrong, and some small, traitorous part of her almost knew it already. He came to her, eventually, with something other than gratitude. It happened 3 weeks later, in the cafeteria of the hospital, in the middle of a Tuesday, with no warning and no driver and no black car. He looked out of place in the fluorescent light, too still, too composed, like a held breath in a room full of exhales, and half the cafeteria noticed him before Marisol did. "I have a proposition," he said, sliding into the seat across from her without asking, which would have annoyed her from anyone else and somehow didn't from him. "I'm on my lunch break. This won't take long. I need someone I can trust to oversee medical care for my people. Someone who won't ask questions she doesn't want answered. Someone who's already proven she doesn't panic when things get ugly." He paused. "I'm offering you a job. I have a job. I'm offering you triple what this job pays, full coverage for your brother's tuition, and the kind of housing that doesn't have black mold in the bathroom ceiling." Marisol's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. She hadn't told him about the mold. She hadn't told anyone about the mold except Priya, in passing, 3 weeks ago. You had someone look into my apartment, she said slowly. I had someone look into you, he corrected, without apology. I don't bring people into my world without knowing who they are. She should have been angrier than she was. She filed it away as something to be angry about later, because what she actually felt, underneath the violation of it, was the cold, practical calculation that had been running in her head every night since her mother died. The rent math that never worked, the tuition payments that ate her overtime before she'd even earned it, the bone-deep exhaustion of being the only thing standing between her brother and a future that slipped further away every semester. What kind of medical care, she said, for what kind of people, men who get hurt doing work most hospitals would report to the police, Dante said, with the flat honesty of a man who had decided lying to her wasn't worth the effort. I'm not going to pretend that's a small thing. I'm not going to pretend you wouldn't be choosing a side. But I will tell you this. Nobody under my protection gets treated the way you'd expect in the world you think I belong to. I don't deal in cruelty for its own sake. I deal in control. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always look like 1 inch. She thought about it for 4 days. She talked to no one, because there was no one she could talk to about this without sounding insane. And on the 5th day, she called the number on the card he'd left and said yes, on one condition. My brother doesn't know what I'm involved in. Ever done, Dante said, like it cost him nothing, and in his world, it didn't. The world she walked into didn't roll out a welcome mat. The first gala she attended on Dante's arm, required, he said, for appearances, for the families who needed to see that the man who ran half the city's underside hadn't lost a step after the attack, was the first time Marisol understood exactly what kind of war she'd stepped into, and it had nothing to do with guns. The dress she wore was beautiful, and it didn't matter, because the moment she walked into that ballroom on Dante's arm, she felt every eye in the room do the same silent calculation. Not her. Not someone who looks like that. What is he doing with someone like that? Camille Duval found her by the bar within 20 minutes, smiling the way people smile when they've already decided to be cruel and are only choosing their angle. You must be the nurse, Camille said, looking Marisol over with the unhurried thoroughness of someone pricing livestock. Dante's little charity project. I think it's sweet, honestly. He's always had a soft spot for strays. I'm not a stray, Marisol said. I'm a nurse. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always look like one to you. Camille's smile thinned. Careful. Men like Dante collect things that make good stories. You'll be a good story for about as long as it takes him to get bored. And I have to say, her eyes dropped, deliberately, slowly. I'd have thought he had better taste. But maybe after the shooting he just wanted someone who could carry him out of a building if it happened again. The room had gone quiet around them in that particular way rooms do when something ugly is happening and everyone is too polite, or too entertained, to stop it. Marisol felt the old heat rise in her chest, the familiar humiliation that had followed her since she was 12 years old, and a gym teacher had laughed at her in front of the whole class. She felt it, and she let it pass through her instead of staying, because she had learned a long time ago that flinching only fed people like Camille. You're right, Marisol said, calm, almost bored. I probably could carry him out of a building. I did, actually, more or less. Where were you that night? Camille's mouth opened, and nothing came out. That's what I thought, Marisol said, and took her drink, and walked away, and didn't look back to see Camille's face, because she didn't need to. She'd seen that look on 100 faces before. It never got easier to be on the receiving end of it. It got easier to survive it without bleeding. Dante found her 20 minutes later on the terrace, where she'd gone to breathe air that didn't smell like perfume and old money. I heard what happened, he said. I'm fine. I know you are. He leaned on the railing beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers. That's not why I came out here. Then why? Because Camille has spent 6 years thinking she was going to marry into this family, and she is wrong about a great many things, but she was right about one. He turned to look at her, and there was something raw in his face that she hadn't seen from him before, something he usually kept locked behind that careful, composed stillness. I have never once, in 15 years, brought anyone into that room who made me want to stand next to them instead of in front of them. Marisol didn't have an answer for that. She drank her wine and looked out at the city lights and let the silence sit between them, comfortable in a way it had no right to be. For what it's worth, Dante added, quieter, you didn't need me to defend you in there. I watched you handle her without raising your voice once. I don't think I've ever respected anyone faster. She didn't tell him that no one had ever said anything like that to her before. She didn't have to. He could see it in the way her shoulders dropped half an inch. Like a held breath she'd been carrying her whole life finally, briefly, let go. The months that followed reshaped her without her quite noticing it happening. She set up a clinic in the east wing of Dante's compound, stocked it properly, trained 2 of his men as field medics, and within 8 weeks the mortality rate among his crew, when things went wrong on a job, had dropped by more than half. She didn't do it to prove anything. She did it because it was the work, and the work was the thing she had always known how to do better than anyone gave her credit for. The men who had looked at her sideways in the first weeks, too soft, too big, too gentle for this world, surely, started showing up at her clinic door with things they'd never have admitted to anyone else. Nightmares, panic that hit them in the middle of jobs, grief for the men they'd lost. She didn't just stitch their wounds. She sat with them in the parts that didn't bleed, and word of that kind of care moved through Dante's organization the way nothing else could have, faster and more permanent than fear. Antonio Reyes, no relation, an irony that made them both laugh the first time they realized it, was Dante's right hand, the man who'd been at his side since before the Empire had a name, and he was the last holdout against her, watching her with a careful, unreadable distance that she clocked and decided not to push. "You don't trust me," she said to him one evening, restocking gauze in the clinic while he stood in the doorway like he was guarding something. "I don't trust easy," Antonio said. "Dante's different around you. Different's dangerous. In this life, I'm not trying to change him, I know," Antonio said, and something flickered behind his eyes that she didn't understand yet, something that looked almost like regret. That's what makes it worse. She didn't think much of it at the time. She had no way of knowing that Antonio had spent 11 years loyal to a man he genuinely loved like a brother, and that loyalty had finally, quietly, fatally cracked under the weight of a debt he'd hidden from everyone, a debt owed to the Castellano family, the same family whose men had ambushed Dante in that parking garage 6 months ago. The attack Marisol had walked into the aftermath of without knowing any of it was connected. She didn't know that Antonio had been feeding the Castellanos information for 4 months, not out of greed, but out of fear for a daughter he'd hidden from this entire world, a daughter the Castellanos had found and threatened and were holding, very precisely, over his head. She didn't know any of it. The night she found Dante in his study at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, staring at nothing. "You haven't slept properly in weeks," she said, not a question. "I don't sleep well anymore," he admitted, which was rare for him, the admission alone a kind of intimacy. "Not since the attack. I keep running it back, trying to find the gap. Someone tipped them off about my route that night. It wasn't random. You think it's someone close to you, I think," he said carefully, "that I don't want to think that. Which is exactly why I have to." She sat with him in the dark for a long time, not offering platitudes, not pretending she had an answer, just being a steady, solid presence in a room that had been carrying too much weight alone for too long. Somewhere in that silence, sitting close enough that their hands rested inches apart on the cushion between them, something shifted that neither of them said out loud. He reached over, slowly, like he expected her to pull away, and laced his fingers through hers. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't let people close. It's not safe, for them or for me. I've buried people I loved because of who I am, Marisol. I won't pretend that isn't a risk I'd be asking you to take. I run into burning buildings for a living," she said. "I think I can handle a little risk. This isn't the same." "No," she agreed. "It's worse. And I'm still here." He looked at her like she'd handed him something he didn't know how to hold, something fragile and enormous at once. And when he kissed her, it wasn't the desperate, hungry thing she might have expected from a man like him. It was slow, careful, like he was committing the shape of it to memory in case it was the only time he got to. It was not the only time. The weeks that followed were the closest thing to happiness Marisol had let herself feel since her mother died. Dante was different with her than he was with anyone else. The careful armor coming down in small, deliberate pieces, late at night, in the quiet hours when the rest of his world believed he was unreachable. He told her things he'd never told anyone, about his father, about the empire he'd inherited soaked in blood he hadn't spilled himself but had to answer for anyway, about the loneliness of being the most powerful man in every room and the only one no one dared to actually know. She told him about her mother, about the riverbed groove of that sentence. You are what you do, not what they say you are, and the way she'd spent her whole life proving it to rooms that didn't want to believe her. They were wrong, Dante said, simple and absolute, the way he said things that weren't up for debate. Every single one of them. You are the strongest person I have ever met, and I have met men who'd put a bullet in their own brother before they'd flinch. You don't have to say that. I don't say things I don't mean. It's the one luxury I've never been able to afford. He tucked a piece of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering against her jaw. You walked into a parking garage full of dead men and saved a stranger because it didn't occur to you to do anything else. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who calculate risk before they move a single inch. You didn't calculate anything. You just helped. I don't think you understand what that did to me. She let herself believe, for a few precious weeks, that this was simply what her life looked like now. She let herself believe the war was over, that the worst had already happened in that parking garage, that the man who loved her in the dark was the only danger she needed to account for. She was wrong, and the night it all came apart began with a phone call Antonio made from a stairwell where he thought no one could hear him. Marisol heard it by accident, walking past the east stairwell on her way to restock the clinic, his voice low and ragged in a way she'd never heard from him before. I can't keep doing this, Antonio was saying, his back to her, his shoulders curled in like he was trying to fold himself smaller. You said this would be the last time. You said if I gave you the warehouse schedule, you'd leave her alone. He stopped talking. Marisol had gone very still in the doorway, every nurse's instinct in her body screaming that she had just walked into something she could not unhear. Antonio turned and saw her standing there, and his face went through fear and grief, and something that looked, horribly, like relief, like a man finally being caught after carrying something alone for too long. Marisol, he said. Wait, let me explain. You're working with the people who tried to kill him, she said, the pieces falling into place with the cold, fast clarity she usually reserved for codes. For the moment a patient crashed and her body moved before her mind had finished catching up. The warehouse schedule. The parking garage. That was you. They have my daughter, Antonio said, and his voice broke on the word, raw in a way that told her this was true, that this wasn't a lie built to save himself. She's 11 years old. They found her 2 years ago, somewhere I thought she was safe, and I have spent every day since trying to keep her alive by feeding them just enough to keep them from hurting her. I never wanted any of this. I love Dante like a brother. I would die for him. But she's my daughter, Marisol. She's 11-inch. Marisol's chest ached with an awful, complicated grief, for the man in front of her, for the choice that had clearly been killing him for months, and underneath it, cold and sharp, the understanding that whatever sympathy she felt didn't change what was coming. They're not going to stop, she said quietly. Antonio, people like that don't let you go once they have something to hold over you. You know that better than I do. I know, he said, and something in his face cracked open completely. They want me to give them tonight's shipment route. The big one, the one that's been planned for months. If I don't, they kill her tonight. If I do. He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence, because they both knew what came next. If he did, the Castellanos would have everything they needed to end Dante Vos permanently, and there would be no second parking garage, no woman with car keys and steady hands to save him. You have to tell him, Marisol said. Right now? Tonight. He can protect her. Antonio, he has resources you don't have alone. But you cannot give them that route. If you give them that route, people die. He dies. You know that, and if I tell him the truth, he kills me himself. Antonio said, hollow. That's the law. You know that too, maybe, Marisol said. Or maybe he loves you enough to find a way through this that doesn't end with everyone you care about dead. But you don't get to find out if you don't try. Antonio looked at her for a long, breaking moment, a man standing at the exact center of an impossible choice. And then something in him gave way, the way exhausted things finally do. Okay, he said. Okay, I'll tell him. But Marisol, if I'm wrong about this, you're not wrong, she said, with a conviction she didn't fully feel, because she had learned a long time ago that sometimes the only thing you can offer someone falling apart is the certainty they can't find in themselves. Go. Now. Before they call again, they never got the chance. The Castellanos had not been waiting patiently for Antonio's loyalty to break on schedule. They had been watching the compound for weeks, and the moment Antonio's burner phone went dark mid-call, they assumed betrayal and moved up their timeline by 6 hours. The attack came at midnight, fast and coordinated, a dozen men hitting 3 points of the compound at once while Dante was in his study reviewing the route Antonio had not yet warned him about. Marisol heard the first shots from the clinic and didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't do the math that would have told a smarter, more careful person to run the other way. She grabbed her trauma kit and moved toward the gunfire instead of away from it, because that was the only direction she had ever known how to move. The compound dissolved into chaos. Dante's men returned fire from the windows. Antonio, gun in hand, fought beside men he'd betrayed and was now dying to protect, his daughter's photo still in his jacket pocket, a debt he was finally paying in the only currency that mattered. He went down covering the east entrance, 3 rounds in his chest, and even as he fell he was shouting Dante's name, warning him about the breach point the Castellanos had found in the south wall. Dante took the warning and the silence underneath it, the unmistakable understanding of what Antonio's warning had cost him to give, and turned just in time to see the man leading the Castellano team raise a gun at his back from the doorway he hadn't cleared. There wasn't time to draw. There wasn't time to think. There was only Marisol, half a second behind him, throwing herself into the space between Dante and the gun because some instinct older than fear had taken over completely. The same instinct that had once sent her running into a parking garage toward a stranger she'd never met. The shot caught her shoulder instead of his spine. She went down hard, white-hot pain blooming through her whole left side. And the last thing she heard before the world narrowed to a roar was Dante's voice screaming her name in a register she had never heard from him before. Not the careful composure of the man who ran an empire, but something raw and human and utterly unguarded, a sound that belonged to nothing but pure terror. He killed the shooter with his bare hands before his own men reached the doorway. Later, no one who was there that night would ever describe exactly what they saw, except to say that Dante Voss had never, in 15 years, looked less controlled, and that none of them ever wanted to see it again. He carried her himself, didn't wait for anyone, didn't let go of her hand even as the doctor, his doctor, the one who owed Dante more debts than he could count, worked to stop the bleeding, his other hand pressed hard over the wound, his voice a steady, broken litany against her ear. Stay with me. Marisol, stay with me. Do you hear me? You don't get to do this. You don't get to be the one who saves everyone. And then, stay with me. She drifted in and out, the pain a distant roar, his voice the only fixed point in a world tilting sideways. And somewhere in the haze she found enough breath to say, told you. I could carry you out of a building. You weren't supposed to take the bullet doing it, he said, something close to a laugh and a sob tangled together in his throat. Wasn't really a choice, she managed. Wasn't going to watch you die? Not after everything. He held her hand through the surgery doors until they wouldn't let him go any further. And then he stood in that hallway for 6 hours, still in a shirt soaked through with her blood, refusing every offer to clean up, refusing every update that wasn't the only one he wanted to hear. She woke 2 days later in a private room with Dante asleep in the chair beside her bed, his hand still curled loosely around hers, dark circles under his eyes that told her he hadn't left once. You're an idiot, he said, the moment he realized she was awake, his voice cracking on the relief of it. You absolute, reckless, you stepped in front of a gun for me. You'd have done the same. That's different. That's my job. That's what I'm supposed to do, what I was built for. You're not supposed to. He stopped, pressed his forehead briefly to the back of her hand, and when he looked up his eyes were wet in a way she suspected he would deny later, if anyone but her ever asked. I have spent my entire life being the most dangerous man in any room I walk into, and I have never once in 15 years been as afraid as I was watching you fall. I'm okay, she said softly. I'm here, you're here, he agreed, because some part of you decided, in half a second, that my life was worth more than your own safety. I need you to understand something, Marisol. I have had people protect me out of fear, out of obligation, out of greed. I have never, not once, had anyone protect me out of love, freely given, with nothing to gain from it. His hand tightened around hers. You are not a stray. You are not a project. You are not a story I'll get bored of. You are the bravest, most extraordinary person I have ever known. and every single person who ever made you feel small for taking up space was wrong. And I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you, if you let me." Antonio survived, barely, 3 surgeries and a coma that lasted 11 days. And when he finally woke, the first thing Dante did, once the rage had burned down into something he could hold without breaking, was send his own men to extract Antonio's daughter from the Castellano property where they'd hidden her, a clean, brutal, surgical strike that ended with the girl asleep in a safe house by morning and 3 Castellano lieutenants no longer drawing breath. "You betrayed me," Dante said to Antonio, the day the older man was strong enough to sit up and hear it, his voice low and dangerous in a way that made even Antonio, who had known him since he was 19, go pale. "I know," Antonio said. "I'd do it again, if it meant keeping her alive. I won't apologize for that. But I am sorry, Dante. I am sorry it cost what it cost." Dante was quiet for a long moment, looking at the man who had been at his side longer than almost anyone alive, the man whose warning, even broken and too late, had saved his life in that doorway. "You don't get to run point on anything for a long time," Dante said finally. "You don't get my full trust back, maybe ever. But your daughter is safe, and she'll stay safe, because you bled for this family even while you were betraying it. And that has to count for something, or none of this means anything." He looked toward the door, toward the hallway where Marisol was resting 2 rooms down, healing from a wound that had been meant for him. "She's the one who told you to come to me. Did you know that? If she hadn't, you'd have given them that route, and we'd both be dead, and your daughter would have grown up without either of us to tell her what her father did to save her. So whatever debt you think you owe me, you owe a larger one to her." 6 months later, Marisol stood in the same ballroom where Camille Duval had once tried to carve her down to nothing, except this time the room had rearranged itself around a truth that could no longer be denied. She wore deep emerald, fitted exactly the way she wanted it fitted, no apology in the cut of it, no attempt to disappear into something smaller than she was. Camille was there, at the edge of the room, watching with an expression that had curdled somewhere between resentment and the dawning, humiliating understanding that she had badly misjudged who held the power in this story. Dante crossed the room to Marisol's side the way he always did now, without hesitation, without calculation, his hand finding the small of her back like it belonged there, because it did. "They're all watching," he murmured against her temple. "Let them," Marisol said, and meant it completely, the old groove of her mother's voice no longer an ache but a foundation, solid under her feet. "You are not what they say you are. You are what you do." He turned her gently, in front of the whole room, in front of every person who had ever looked at her sideways and found her wanting, and went down on one knee with a small velvet box that had clearly been waiting for the right moment far longer than 6 months. "I have run an empire for 15 years, he said, loud enough for the room to hear, his eyes never leaving hers. "I have never once been as certain of anything as I am of this. You walked into the worst night of my life and saved it without knowing my name. You have spent every day since refusing to let anyone, including me, convince you that you are anything less than extraordinary. I would like the rest of my life to be the proof that they were always wrong about you, and I would be honored, more than I have words for, if you would let me spend it trying." The room that had once mocked her went utterly silent, and into that silence, Marisol Reyes said yes, and somewhere behind her, she was almost certain she heard Antonio, leaning on a cane he'd need for another month, mutter something that sounded suspiciously like "about time." If a story like this reminded you that the people who underestimate you have always been wrong, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, have you ever had to prove someone completely wrong about who you really are?